Hello, this is Carl Weinshank for the Daily Music Break. We have the pleasure of speaking to John Masouri today. John is a music journalist and the author of 5 books on reggae and at Reggae World. First of all, welcome, John. Thank you very, very much for taking time out today.
My pleasure. I really admire the work you're doing, and conversations about music in this fashion, very, very much appreciated and very much needed too.
Thank you very, very much. So before we get started with the questions about reggae per se, what is your latest book and when was it published?
I've had 2 books out in the last 6 months. They're part of a series called the Reggae Chronicles. And because for most of the last 30 years, my work has only appeared in print.
Mm-hmm.
And in the digital age, there's a different audience, obviously. And so I decided to go through my archives and group them in subjects, basically. The first was called Reggae Frequency, which is a collection of about 50 interviews and articles on the new music from Jamaica, which has appeared over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
With figureheads like Chronix, Protege, Kabaka Pyramid, and so on. I've had the privilege of documenting that movement from almost the beginning, and I've interviewed many names, great and small, from that movement. I followed that with the Marley Files, which is a collection of writings, Bob Marley related and Wailers related writings, which hadn't appeared in any of my books, but which were dealing with singular issues. Maybe they were reviews, maybe articles on some aspect of the Marley family or the Wailers.
Beautiful, beautiful. For our audience that loves reggae but might not be obviously as familiar with it as you, but just know they like the music without knowing that much about it. Could you place it in its historical context in terms of what preceded it and what led to it in Jamaica, and also what other international influences from Europe and from the States, and I would imagine from Africa as well, permeates it?
You're talking about the genesis of reggae music in Jamaica?
Yes.
Which was a synthesis of music from New Orleans, British pop, American pop, doo-wop, rhythm and blues, jazz, big band jazz, calypso from Trinidad, music from Cuba and from South America, mento, which was like a Jamaican folk music, also strands of British folk songs, a very rich melting pot, and also the nationality of the musicians who gave birth to reggae music in Jamaica weren't all Jamaican either, but they came from various parts of the Caribbean. There were even some Australians in there. So it was a bit like hip hop, with a coming together of African American, Latino, and white, forging that culture. And reggae music had very varied origins in the same way.
And I've always heard the term ska as a predecessor. What is ska, and how, and was that almost like a backbone of it, or was that just another one of these strands?
No, that was the first international music that came from Jamaica. Most of the musicians who played it were classically trained. They were jazz players. There were a lot of horn players amongst them. They were inspired by all of those elements I've just spoken about.
Right.
But we're talking about a period around the time of Jamaican independence in 1962. So you can imagine that there was this tremendous sense of optimism. It was a new country. They were freed from the rule of the British, and they had the chance to basically reinvent the country in the image of the people who were there, not from outside. And Ska fitted that narrative extremely well.
Are there characteristics, and this is the last kind of background sort of question to orient folks, is there a specific thing you can point to that characterizes reggae from all these other things? Is there a characteristic thing about reggae that distinguishes it?
I can't give you the technical. I've written about it, and I've written musicians' testimony to how they actually changed the beat and so on. But you can hear it. I mean, there's a difference between New Orleans shuffle beat, like Fats Domino, and ska, which is perhaps quicker and harder in many ways, exuberant even. So I think at that stage, it was also character that carried it a lot, attitude, with this particular Jamaican character, which is full of life and all of the characteristics that go into being Jamaican.
If you love reggae, but only really know of Bob, I mean, everyone knows Bob Marley, and almost everyone, or just about everyone, knows Peter Tosh. If you were suggesting to someone sitting next to someone on an airplane or a nosy journalist, who are the next folks you would recommend that they listen to, both because it's easy to get into and love, and also because it's characteristic of reggae? Who are the next people on the list, so to speak?
I would recommend the current generation of artists, because and then work backwards.
Okay.
Because the current crop of reggae artists, I think, embody so much in common with the classical music of the 70s. They too preach love and harmony. They too have social commentary. They write songs about the environment, about politics, about what human nature, what humans are doing to the planet, how people can come together and create a better, fairer society. All of these elements are in nowadays reggae music, but also, very importantly, current reggae music is made up of every nationality you can think of.
Right.
I mean, when I started writing about reggae music 30 odd years ago, it was mainly coming from Jamaica predominantly, America to a degree, but only really in New York, and then Britain certainly, and little pockets in Europe, but that was about it. And now we have so much good reggae music coming from Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, the west coast of America, all over Europe, especially Germany, France, Poland, Sweden, the Netherlands. It's truly global in scope now.
And who are some of the leading names now? Who are some of the big players now?
Protege, who has his own label, Indignation, with some very good talent coming through, like Savannah and Leela Ike. I would say Damian Marley, Chronix, Janine, Kabaka Pyramid, Micah Shemaiah, lots of people.
Great names. I love the names. And if historically, going back to what we were talking about before, when someone wanted to get really grounded in reggae beyond the Wailers and Marley and Peter Tosh, who who are the giant. I consider in my primitive way the Wailers to be sort of the Beatles of reggae. I don't know if that analogy really holds up, but beyond that, who would you recommend historically as some people to really listen to?
Well, from the 70s, I would say Burning Spear, the Royal Rassers, the Abyssinians, the Gladiators, the Heptones, Dennis Brown, Gregory Isaacs, Toots and the Maytals, Third World, so many people from the 80s. There's a whole, every era has giants from that era who are really worth listening to. But you know, for me personally, although I grew up, I became interested in reggae music in the 60s and started going to concerts and so on in the 70s. And I saw so many of the greats in concert and so on. But for me, the 90s is probably my favorite decade for reggae music of all.
Mm-hmm.
And this current period from, say, 2010 onwards,
Right.
is another truly golden era for reggae music.
Okay, and actually, I want to apologize to you. I sent you a list of questions, and I probably haven't asked a question on the list yet, and I always fall into that trap. So I apologize.
Please ask whatever you wish.
And it sounds like you have no problem with the questions, so it's not like you don't know your topic. When I think, as I said, in my opinion, the primitive opinion, the Wailers are like the Beatles of reggae. And one thing about the Beatles is, if you look at the change in the Beatles from the early 60s to when they broke up, I mean, it was obviously monumental. You went from the Mop Tops to the White Album.
Yes.
And when I look at old video of reggae and of the Wailers at the beginning, and then Bob Marley at the end, I guess before he got ill, there seems to be a similar transition at warp speed. Is that true? Do you see that analogy too? That also that the music just evolved so quickly, and the presentation of the music evolved very, very quickly during those years?
I don't think it evolved any quicker than what happened for the Beatles. Because if you say the Beatles were the Mop Tops in 62, 63, and the White Album was what, 68, 69, and they split up in 1970, well then the Wailers, it's a similar time period we're talking about. Because from doo-wop to dreadlocks, it took 10 years. When they formed around the same time as the Beatles, 62, 63, just after independence, they were heavily inspired by American doo-wop and rhythm and blues.
You hear that. Yeah.
But, by 1973, they embraced Rastafari, were beginning to grow their hair in dreadlocks, and they were promoting a very different style of reggae music, which was intrinsically Jamaican in character.
Okay. Who was Chris Blackwell, and what? One of the things someone like me had to back up a second. I can read on Wikipedia, read at various websites about things about reggae, but or jazz or something else that I didn't personally grow up with and experience. I might read a particular thing and think, wow, this is really important. This was a very important person or a very important event. But in reality, it wasn't. It was, a small incident or someone who was just kind of involved, tangentially. So with that in mind, who was Chris Blackwell, and was he important in the rise of reggae? I guess that's...
I think he was crucial to the rise of reggae music. I mean, he was Jamaican, but he was very well educated. He had resources behind him, but he also had a vision for the music and the culture of Jamaica long before most other people, whether it was applied to music or to films, literature, photography, films. He made a lot of things happen. He actually used his platform, Island Records, to empower a lot of people to get involved, whether they were journalists or photographers or whatever. He made it happen. I respect that very highly of him, and he deserves to be honored to the extent he has been in Jamaica. But when I was writing Wailing Blues, I spent a lot of time, and I was very close to Aston Family Man Barrett, the Wailers bass player. And I was at his court case against Chris Blackwell and the Bob Marley estate in 2006. And I was at the Old Bailey in London every day. And one memorable day, the judge called Family Man to the stand and said, Mr. Barrett, how would you describe Chris Blackwell in his relationship to the Wailers? And Family Man said, well, Your Honor, he was the plantation owner and we were the musical slaves.
No, that's not good. That's very, very kind of suggestive of a lot of very, very big issues, you know. So that's must have been quite a moment, I guess. It must have stopped everybody in their tracks.
Yes, I think so. It didn't help Family Man with the court case, though.
No, I imagine not. Now, one of the things I read talking about Blackwell, and the reason I had that build up with incidents, you know, talking about incidents, my understanding from reading something is that the Wailers were developing, and then Chris Blackwell wanted them to play some clubs here in the States that, you know, in a tour of the United States, and that I guess it was Tosh and Bunny Wailer objected because it was against the Rastafarian religion, and that led to a kind of a schism. And I guess my question is that a true story? And if so, was it an important event in kind of the family tree of reggae, or is it just something I happen to read and think it's important?
I think it's two things put together. I mean, we've got to remember that when he said that, if he said that, we're talking about 1972, 1973. And it was the hippie era. Rock was the dominant music. It was long hair. It was counterculture. And I think when he was explaining to them that they would need to go and tour in America, and it would be different audiences, because outside of pockets of New York, we're not talking about you know, mixed crowds necessarily, or too many African Americans either. He knew, Chris Blackwell, that the audiences would be mainly long-haired college students who would relate to a band, you know, of long-haired people playing guitars who smoked weed. That was the attraction. And so it's quite possible that Chris Blackwell said, you'll be playing in freak clubs.
Right.
But he would probably have meant the Matrix in San Francisco, or Max's Kansas City in New York, places where hippies and other counterculture people would go. And so if Bunny Wailer we're talking about, because he was the first one who left the group, I doubt that was the main reason. The truth was that Bunny and Peter had their differences with Chris Blackwell before then, and they were mistrustful of him.
Mhm.
And I think they would be mistrustful of, most major record labels at that time,
Mhm.
because they'd already been together 10 years and they'd already suffered financially and otherwise at the hands of producers, record producers in Jamaica,
Mhm.
beginning with Cox and Dodd and including Lee Scratch Perry. So therefore, there was a level of suspicion there.
Mhm.
And Chris Blackwell, he represented a risk. And I think Bob Marley realized that he didn't have to get on with people in order to put his music out there, that you have to make concessions sometimes to get what you want. And maybe his level of professionalism was greater than the other two.
So, so I was, when I originally put these questions together, one of the questions was whether the Wailers kind of over time increasingly had Bob Marley as the frontman. Did it go from Marley being one of, being equal to the others, to, at least in the public persona, Bob Marley being, very photogenic and, the singer and the vocalist? Did it become more his band over time? Or did this split mean that the Wailers, even though the name stayed with Marley, just kind of split into two different bands?
Well, when they first formed in Trenchtown in the very early 60s, Bob Marley was the only one who'd actually made a record by that stage. He made it for Leslie Kong, Judge Not, One Cup of Coffee, 2 records. And so he had that experience. But Peter Tosh was the only one who could play guitar. And so he brought that skill to the group. And Bunny Wailer had the most wonderful lead voice and harmony voice. So I think in the beginning, although Bob Marley had that advantage of being, having had a record out, having been in a studio, the other two, and especially Peter Tosh, had also felt that they played an important role,
Sure.
a key role. And they used to take it in turns as well, to sing lead on certain songs. I mean, there's some great records coming from the 4 years they spent at Studio One with Peter Tosh singing lead,
Mm-hmm.
and also Bunny Wailer singing lead vocals.
Mm-hmm.
So they were very adaptable in that way. And when Bob Marley went off to stay with his mother in Delaware, the other two found a replacement for him temporarily and carried on. And they had hits as the Wailers.
Mm-hmm.
But when they got together with Lee Perry especially, you began to see singles credited to Bob Marley and the Wailers. And that was before Chris Blackwell got involved. So it wasn't Chris Blackwell who actually introduced that element. I think it was probably more accurate to say he reintroduced it, because to my mind, when Peter and Bunny left and Bob Marley decided to carry on as Bob Marley and the Wailers, that would have been very distressing to the other two,
Mm-hmm.
because it served to diminish the 10 years they'd had of not only triumphs, i.e. the hits, the chart hits in Jamaica, but also the struggles and the hardships. And all of that was confused at best by Bob Marley calling his backing musicians the Wailers. And this has caused a tremendous amount of confusion.
Yeah. Yeah, I started out going through Wikipedia trying to keep it straight, and I'm thinking of like, okay, the Grateful Dead, New Riders and Purple Sage, Hot Tuna, Jefferson Airplane. So I'm trying to, you know, and I know that stuff because I grew up with it and I loved it and I could recite it chapter and verse, but no one, you know, else who didn't grow up with it.
The way I explain it is, imagine if Mick Jagger
Right,
had decided to leave the Rolling Stones in the 70s.
right,
He's the big star,
right,
and he was the name everyone recognized. So he decided to leave the Rolling Stones, form a new band, and call them the Rolling Stones.
right.
Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. Where does that leave the others? What do they call themselves? And that's why Bunny Wailer, who was always Bunny Livingston up until that point, decided that he would call himself Bunny Wailer to let everyone know that that was his legacy as well. That's what he represented. He was a wailer. And these other musicians, and it was no fault of theirs, they didn't ask to be called the Wailers.
Right.
They took over the mantle. And that animosity between Bunny Wailer and the Wailers musicians exists to this very day.
Mm-hmm.
And the confusion with it.